It's February 8th, and on February 8th of 1950 was the formation of the Stasi police state in East Germany. So remember that Germany was kind of like the epicenter of World War II. And then after World War II, they just kind of cut it down the middle, right? And they created like a line, and they kind of gave Germany half to the Soviets and half to Western influence. And the Stasi police force, formed in 1950, today, several rotations back, was the essentially kind of parallel to the KGB. At first, it started highly aligned with the KGB. Eventually, they got to the point where the KGB had like one kind of liaison at each office. And one of those KGB officers that was a liaison to the Stasi was a young man named Vladimir Putin, who kind of continued climbing the ranks after that. It took years for the Stasi to like really amp up. And at first, it really was kind of a heavy handed state police force. But they realized over about 20 years that they couldn't keep this kind of state police force with the heavy handedness that it had and not get both international attention and local demonstrations. So the Stasi became kind of the epicenter of a different kind of technique of human control. So what they started doing was something called decomposition. Decomposition is in like degrading, right? Unbuilding. Worms decompose things, and the Stasi was in charge of decomposing people who were troublemakers, right? So they created a system of coming in and destroying people's lives from the inside in ways that were not remarkable, because the heavy-handed techniques of taking people and locking them up and removing people completely immediately or assassinating people generally were not working. What they needed was a way to control people without it being so obvious and without making people so angry. Instead, it was about the Stasi decomposition. So for the Stasi decomposition, you had things like encouraging unemployment for people, right? If somebody was starting to cause problems, they would undermine their employment, they would undermine their social status, they would do things to essentially gaslight them into socially isolating or believing that their social isolation was a result of them. Because humans are incredibly socially driven, right? The thing that you can take away from people that hurts the most is their social connection. So by socially isolating people, they were able to control people. And they would gaslight people by breaking into their house. This is all documented. This is all real. This is not like, they would break into people's houses and they would move things around. They would replace the tea that they had in a particular jar with a different flavor of tea. They would move pictures on the walls ever so slightly, right? They would undermine the security of their own home, and they would create these kind of moments where the people around them were not being friendly to them anymore. They would undermine their relationships. There's like things where like they sent sex toys to a man's wife without telling him, so that it undermined that relationship. Just all kinds of absolutely bonkers small manipulation tactics, right? This is gaslighting. This is gaslighting. This is state sanctioned gaslighting and state sanctioned isolation. This wasn't like a small group, right? So the Stasis were like a huge chunk of the population. The actual Stasi officers went through a lot of training and were a relatively small set, but the Stasi informants were much broader. If you had 166 people at an event, one of them was statistically an officer. But you had way more informants. And some of the informants were paid. Some of them were just doing it for funsies because humans are wild. And some of them were being coerced. So some of them were being told, if you don't cooperate, your family's at risk, etc. But mostly they were being paid or they had the social influence, right? So you had one in every 166 people was an officer. But it's more like every one in every 65 people was essentially a full time informant. And then you had a bunch of people who were part time informants when they heard something that was interesting. They would bring it back, but they weren't like full time. And so the total estimate of official informants is about 2.5%, but the network of informants was high enough that you end up having one in every 12 people is probably an informant at one point. So they had a Stasi officer at every industrial plant. They had Stasi informants at every apartment building. Everybody's comings and goings were being recorded, right? They were doing things like this is old school tech, and they were doing things like drilling tiny holes in walls and putting cameras into people's apartments, putting cameras into shared spaces. They were tracking people's behavior and then using these deconstruction techniques when people were acting suspicious. So February 8th, 1950, they formed, but it wasn't really until maybe the 1970s that they really got to the point where they were like, wow, this is this crude method of control, kind of just bossing people around, isn't working anymore. So they took these Stasi techniques and they trained them not only in Europe. So they ended up training folks in Egypt and Cuba and Zanzibar and Syria and Ethiopia. They took these techniques and they basically said, this is the way to control the populace, right? This old method of like coming in and quickly grabbing people is a crude version of kind of state control. But we have this other, better version. And that version was such deep security, such deep, deep control over people's lives that they knew that they were being watched at all times. They knew that their behavior was under surveillance. And that when they started acting up, the way to isolate them was to isolate them. The way to isolate them was not to pull them aside, it was to cut into their job, it was to cut into their relationships, it was to break into their house and move things around. They set up brothels so that they could undermine and blackmail people for either married men. They would have them sleep with women and then they would blackmail them or try to control them with that. But they would also have them sleep with homosexual prostitutes and then blackmail them with that, right? They also undermined kind of trust in the US during this process, which, you know, some of this is like mid Cold War, and trust, in fact, was tricky. But they also just actively did the things to undermine trust. So they recorded conversations of between two of their politicians and then released it as proof of American spying. So they recorded, in current lingo, they recorded their own sex tape and released it, but it was just politicians talking. But they did that. They also were part of creating this narrative that still proliferates across the world today, that the U.S. created AIDS, and that is like a U.S. created virus. That was Stasi propaganda to begin with. The other thing that the Stasis were doing that doesn't really make sense on the surface, but makes sense underneath, is they were supporting neo-Nazi movements and anti-Semitism. So they had just, remember we just took Germany and split it in half, right? We drew a line down the middle, exactly like we used to do in our bedrooms when we were kids and didn't want to share with our siblings anymore. We drew a line down the middle. And that was because the Nazis, and specifically kind of an anti Semitic fascism, had gotten out of control. But now the enemy of our enemy is our friend, coming from the Soviets again. They begin supporting financially and spurring neo Nazi movements. They sent teams to do anti Semitic and swastika graffiti at some graveyards, Jewish graveyards. They did things. They did things. On Pope John Paul II in like 1980 or 81 or something like that. The Stasi was somehow involved in that. They weren't the ones to do it. That was KGB, but they were involved in the planning of that thing. The Stasis were doing all of this at the same time that social psychology was beginning to realize that social isolation and gaslighting and all of these things were powerful tools too. So this isn't just coming out of this, right? If the Stasis had not been formed and KGB hadn't supported them, then it's not like these techniques wouldn't have gotten out, right? This was happening. This is a parallel understanding. But it is the thing that shows us that this authoritarian police state, given a little bit of time, understands that the crude methods of locking people up and removing them isn't necessary to, at least for a while, control the populace, right? So the people who were mostly being targeted by this, Protestants, people involved in the Protestant church, to some degree, people involved in religion in general, people who were artists, people who were writers, people who were thinkers, people who were involved in kind of the youth movements. Anytime anybody was getting a little too powerful, they were squashed. When somebody started doing too much, suddenly they were, caught at a brothel. Their relationships disappeared, their jobs disappeared, their social connections disappeared. And when people don't have those, they can't function. So, happy February 8th.